A 7-year-old girl, working alone in her father's garage at 3 a.m., catches the attention of passing bikers. When tears mix with grease on tiny hands, unlikely protectors discover a heartbreaking secret. But no one expected what these hardened men would do next. Before we begin the story, say the name of your city if you feel comfortable sharing. And leave your like. It helps us bring more stories like this. The rumble of 8 Harley-Davidsons echoed through the sleeping streets of Cedar Falls, Iowa, as the Midnight Patrol made its usual rounds through their territory. Diesel Murphy, president of the Midwest chapter of the Hells Angels, led the formation with the practiced ease of a man who'd been riding these roads for 23 years. At 51, his weathered face bore the scars of countless battles, but his steel-blue eyes still held the sharp awareness that had kept him alive through 2 decades of motorcycle club politics. Behind him rode his core crew, Tank Wilson, the club's enforcer whose gentle soul hid behind 300 pounds of pure muscle, Wrench Rodriguez, their treasurer and part-time philosopher, and 5 other men whose loyalty had been forged in blood, chrome, and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. As they cruised past Thompson's auto repair, Diesel noticed something that made him signal for a stop. Light spilled from the garage's open bay doors, unusual for 3 in the morning. But what caught his attention wasn't the light. It was the small figure moving inside, barely tall enough to reach the workbench. "Boss?" Tank pulled alongside, his massive frame making his custom chopper look like a child's toy. "Something's not right," Diesel replied, cutting his engine and walking toward the garage. His boots crunched on gravel as he approached the bay doors, the familiar scent of motor oil and metal mixing with something else, the salt smell of tears. Inside the garage, 7-year-old Madison Thompson stood on a wooden crate, her tiny hands struggling to tighten a bolt on a customer's transmission. Her father's oversized coveralls hung on her small frame like a tent, the sleeves rolled up multiple times and still covering her hands. Grease streaked her cheeks where she'd wiped away tears, and her usually bright brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail that spoke of a child trying to do adult work. "Hey there, little mechanic," Diesel said gently, his voice carrying none of the intimidation that usually preceded his arrival anywhere. Madison spun around, her eyes wide with fear and embarrassment. She'd been caught, and she knew it. For weeks, she'd been sneaking into the garage after bedtime, trying to finish the repairs her father could no longer complete. "Mr. Diesel," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. "I wasn't. I was just working on Mrs. Henderson's transmission at 3 in the morning. Diesel approached slowly, his massive presence somehow managing to seem non-threatening as he knelt to her eye level. "Where's your daddy, sweetheart?" The question broke something inside Madison's carefully constructed facade. Tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally spilled over, and her small shoulders shook with the weight of secrets too heavy for a 7-year-old to carry. "He's sick," she whispered, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "Really, really sick. And he can't work anymore, but people keep bringing their cars. And if we don't fix them, they won't pay us. And if they don't pay us, we can't pay for his medicine. And the doctors said..." Her words dissolved into sobs that echoed through the garage like physical pain. Diesel felt something twist in his chest, the same protective instinct that had made him a fierce leader and an even fiercer enemy to anyone who threatened his family. "Madison," he said softly, using her name for the first time since she was a toddler following her father around the garage. "Where is your daddy right now?" "Hospital," she hiccuped. "Been there 3 days. Uncle Pete drives me to see him after school, but he doesn't know I come here at night." Nobody knows. Diesel looked around the garage with new eyes. Joe Thompson had been fixing Angel's bikes for 15 years, never once asking where they'd been or what they'd done. When other shops in town refused to serve them, Joe had simply nodded and gotten to work. He'd never charged extra for the hassle of working on outlaw motorcycles, never called the police when heated arguments broke out in his parking lot, never treated them as anything other than customers who needed honest work done right. What kind of sick? Diesel asked gently. Madison's small hands twisted in the oversized coveralls. Cancer, the kind that's really bad. Uncle Pete says it's in his lungs and his bones and everywhere. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The doctors say he might not come home. The garage fell silent, except for the distant hum of traffic and the soft sound of Madison's breathing. Diesel felt the familiar rage building in his chest, not at the child or her father, but at a world that could burden a 7-year-old with such impossible choices. Madison, honey, how long have you been doing this? 2 weeks, she admitted, not meeting his eyes. Since Daddy went back to the hospital, I watched him work lots of times, and I'm real good with tools for my age. Mrs. Henderson's car just needs the transmission fluid changed, and Mr. Garcia's truck needs new brake pads, and you're 7 years old, Diesel interrupted gently. This isn't your job, sweetheart. But it is, Madison said with the fierce determination that only children possess. Daddy says family takes care of family. It's just me and him, so I got to take care of him. If the garage closes, we lose everything. The house, the business, even Daddy's tools that belong to his daddy. Diesel stood slowly, his mind already working through possibilities and resources. Behind him, he heard the soft footsteps of his crew approaching, drawn by voices and the unusual sight of their president kneeling in a garage at 3 a.m. Tank, Diesel said without turning around. Call Doc Martinez. Tell him we need him at Cedar Falls General. Priority 1. Tell him it's family business. Madison looked up with confusion. Mr. Diesel? I don't understand. Diesel knelt again, his scarred hands surprisingly gentle as he helped Madison down from her makeshift step stool. Your daddy ever tell you about brotherhood, Madison? She nodded, wiping her nose on her sleeve. He said it means people who got your back no matter what. That's right, and your daddy's had our backs for 15 years. Fixed our bikes, kept our secrets, treated us like human beings when the rest of this town saw us as trouble. Diesel's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Time we returned the favor. But I don't got money to pay you, Madison whispered. Diesel smiled, the first genuine smile his crew had seen from him in months. Little girl, family doesn't charge family. And Joe Thompson became family the first time he handed me back my keys without asking where I'd been riding. By dawn, Thompson's auto repair had been transformed into something resembling a military operation. Tank Wilson stood guard at the front entrance, his imposing presence deterring curious neighbors while simultaneously directing the steady stream of angels arriving from chapters across 3 states. Wrench Rodriguez had taken over the garage's small office, his laptop connected to their communications network as he coordinated what was rapidly becoming the largest mobilization in the club's recent history. Madison sat on a milk crate beside Diesel's workstation, watching in amazement as 8 of the most feared men in the Midwest carefully disassembled Mrs. Henderson's transmission with the precision of surgeons. Her father's tools looked almost delicate in their massive hands, but their work was methodical and expert. How do you know how to fix cars? Madison asked Tank, who was delicately adjusting valve springs with surprising grace for his enormous fingers. Learned in the army, Tank replied, his deep voice carrying surprising gentleness when addressing the child. Worked on Humvees and transport trucks. Motors are motors, little bit. Once you understand how they breathe, everything else is just following the logic. Diesel emerged from the office, his phone still pressed to his ear as he finished a conversation that had lasted 20 minutes. Doc Martinez will be at the hospital within the hour, he announced. Best oncologist this side of Chicago, and he owes me favors going back to when his own kid got mixed up with some bad people. Madison's eyes widened. You mean a special doctor for Daddy? Real special, Wrench confirmed, looking up from the brake job he was completing on Mr. Garcia's truck. Doc Martinez has connections at research hospitals, access to experimental treatments that regular doctors don't even know about. But that costs lots of money, Madison said, her 7-year-old understanding of finance limited but painfully accurate. Diesel knelt beside her crate, his presence somehow making the chaotic garage feel safer. "Madison, I'm going to tell you something important about how families work. When one person hurts, everybody hurts. When one person needs help, everybody helps. Your daddy's been family to us for 15 years. Time we started acting like it." "Diesel!" Tank called from the transmission he was rebuilding. "We got company!" Through the garage doors, Madison could see a small convoy of cars approaching, her Uncle Pete's pickup truck leading 3 other vehicles filled with people she recognized from around town. Her stomach clenched with fear. Uncle Pete would be furious when he discovered her midnight workshop sessions. Uncle Pete Kowalski emerged from his truck with the purposeful stride of a man prepared for confrontation. At 62, he'd been Joe Thompson's best friend since high school, and he'd taken his role as Madison's guardian seriously since Joe's diagnosis. Behind him came Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Garcia, and several other customers whose vehicles sat in various stages of repair throughout the garage. "What the hell is going on here?" Pete demanded, his eyes taking in the scene of leather-clad bikers working on customer vehicles, while his 7-year-old niece supervised from her makeshift throne. "Madison, you get away from those men right now!" "Uncle Pete," Madison started, but Diesel raised a hand that somehow commanded attention from everyone in the garage. "Mr. Kowalski," Diesel said, his voice carrying the formal respect reserved for family meetings. "We need to talk, all of us, Mrs. Henderson, a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher who'd taught half the town, including several of the Angels' children, stepped forward with the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult conversations. "Pete, before you start yelling, maybe we should understand what's happening here." She looked around the garage, noting the professional quality of work being performed on her transmission. "Madison, sweetheart, why don't you explain what you've been doing?" Madison looked between her uncle and Diesel, caught between the fear of adult anger and the hope that somehow, impossibly, things might work out. "I was trying to help Daddy," she said in a small voice. "People need their cars fixed, and if we don't fix them, they don't pay us. And if they don't pay us—" "Jesus Christ, Madison," Pete breathed, understanding flooding his features. "You've been coming here alone at night." "She's been trying to save her family," Diesel said quietly. 7 years old, and she's been carrying weight that would break most grown men, working with tools bigger than she is, trying to keep a business running, trying to pay medical bills that would bankrupt half the people in this room. Tank stood from his position beside the transmission, oil-stained rag in his massive hands. "Found this in the office," he said, holding up a stack of past-due notices and medical bills. Kid wasn't exaggerating about the money situation. Pete took the bills with shaking hands, his face growing pale as he read amounts that represented more money than most people in Cedar Falls made in several years. "Joe never told me it was this bad," he whispered. "Because Joe Thompson's got pride," Wrench said from his position under Mr. Garcia's truck. "Same pride that made him treat us with respect when nobody else would. Same pride that's probably killing him now, knowing he can't provide for his little girl." Mrs. Henderson approached Madison's crate, her teacher instincts taking over as she noticed the exhaustion in the child's eyes. "Sweetheart, how many nights have you been doing this?" "Every night since Daddy went back to the hospital," Madison admitted. "I finish my homework, wait till Uncle Pete goes to sleep, then ride my bike here. I know where Daddy keeps the spare key." The garage fell silent as the full scope of Madison's secret sacrifice became clear. A 7-year-old child had been living a double life, attending school during the day and running an auto repair business at night, all to keep her dying father's dreams alive. "Well, Mrs. Henderson said finally, her voice carrying the decisive tone that had managed thousands of students over 4 decades of teaching, "It seems to me that this child has been trying to solve an adult problem all by herself. Perhaps it's time for the adults to step up." Diesel looked around the garage at the faces surrounding Madison, her uncle's guilt and worry, the customer's growing understanding, his own crew's protective determination. "Mrs. Henderson's right," he said. Madison's been carrying this alone for too long. Time for family to act like family. What are you proposing? Pete asked, his suspicion warring with desperate hope. Diesel's smile carried the weight of absolute commitment. We are proposing to remind this town what brotherhood really means. And we're starting with making sure Joe Thompson comes home to a daughter who never had to grow up too fast because adults failed to protect her. Madison looked up at the circle of adults surrounding her, hope and fear battling in her 7-year-old heart. For the first time in weeks, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to carry the weight of the world all by herself. The transformation of Thompson's auto repair over the following week defied everything Cedar Falls thought it knew about Hell's Angels. What had begun as Diesel's promise to help a struggling family evolved into something resembling a community-wide revival, with the garage serving as headquarters for an operation that touched every corner of the small Iowa town. Madison arrived each morning after school to find her father's business running with military precision. Angels from chapters across the Midwest had descended on Cedar Falls, each man contributing skills learned in previous lives. Former Marines handled the heavy mechanical work, ex-truckers managed parts procurement, and several members who'd once worked construction began expanding the garage's capacity to handle the flood of new customers. Madison called Hammer Jackson, a soft-spoken giant who'd driven down from Minneapolis specifically to install a new hydraulic lift system. "Come see what your daddy's shop looks like now," Madison gasped as she entered the main bay. Where once a single car lift had struggled to handle the occasional transmission job, now 3 professional-grade lifts gleamed under new LED lighting. Tool chests that had cost more than her father's annual income lined the walls, and diagnostic equipment that belonged in dealerships hummed quietly in climate-controlled corners. "This is too much," Uncle Pete said quietly to Diesel, his voice mixing gratitude with concern. "Joe's a proud man. When he gets back seeing all this, he might not understand." Diesel finished tightening the last bolt on a customer's engine before responding. "Pete, your brother-in-law spent 15 years treating my people like human beings when the rest of this town crossed the street to avoid us. He never charged us extra, never called the cops when our arguments got heated, never once made us feel unwelcome. But this equipment costs more than Joe Thompson could afford, which is exactly the point," Tank interrupted, emerging from beneath a pickup truck with a satisfied expression. "Man's been making miracles happen with tools held together by prayer and duct tape. Time he had proper equipment to match his skills." Madison climbed onto her usual milk crate, now positioned beside a state-of-the-art diagnostic computer that could identify problems faster than her father had ever dreamed possible. "Will Daddy really be okay with all this?" "He'll be okay with you not having to work at 3 in the morning, Wrench said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too many children forced to grow up too fast. "He'll be okay with knowing his business can support his family without his little girl having to sacrifice her childhood." Through the office window, Madison could see Mrs. Henderson coordinating with a steady stream of townspeople, bringing casseroles, offers of help, and, most importantly, vehicles that needed repair. Word had spread through Cedar Falls that Thompson's Auto Repair was not only back in business, but operating at a level of professionalism that exceeded anything the town had ever seen. "Speaking of your daddy," Diesel said, checking his watch, "Doc Martinez should be calling soon with an update. He's been running tests all week, trying to find treatment options that the local doctors missed." Madison's small hands twisted nervously. Every day brought the same cycle of hope and fear. Hope that the special doctor might have answers. Fear that those answers might be the ones she dreaded most. Uncle Pete had tried to explain cancer to her, but 7-year-old minds struggled with concepts like terminal and palliative care. The phone in the office rang, cutting through the mechanical sounds of the garage like a blade. Diesel, Pete, and Madison froze, understanding that this call might change everything. Wrench answered on the second ring, his expression carefully neutral as he listened to the voice on the other end. After several minutes of medical terminology that Madison couldn't follow, he hung up and turned to face the group. "Doc Martinez has news," Wrench announced, his voice carefully controlled. The experimental imaging they did revealed something the local doctors missed. Joe's cancer isn't as advanced as they thought. Some of what they identified as tumors are actually inflammatory responses to an infection. Madison's world stopped spinning. "Does that mean—" "It means your daddy might be a candidate for a new treatment protocol that Doc Martinez has been developing," Diesel explained, kneeling to Madison's eye level. "Aggressive, experimental, but with success rates that look promising." Pete's voice cracked with emotion. "What kind of treatment? What does it involve?" "Would specialized chemotherapy combined with targeted radiation and immunotherapy," Wrench read from his notes. 6 months of intensive treatment at a research facility in Chicago, followed by ongoing monitoring and support therapy. "Chicago," Madison whispered. "That's really far away." Tank appeared in the office doorway, having overheard the conversation. "Little bit, sometimes healing requires traveling, but the important thing is that your daddy might get better, really better." Madison looked around at the faces surrounding her. Uncle Pete crying openly for the first time since her father's diagnosis, Diesel's scarred features softened by genuine hope, and the various angels who'd become her extended family over the past week. "What about the garage?" she asked, her 7-year-old mind immediately jumping to practical concerns. "If Daddy has to go to Chicago for 6 months, what happens to all the customers? What happens to the business we just fixed up?" Diesel exchanged glances with Tank and Wrench, a silent communication passing between men who'd learned to trust each other's judgment over years of brotherhood. "Madison," Diesel said slowly, "how would you feel about having some temporary partners in the family business? People who could keep Thompson's Auto Repair running while your daddy gets better." "You mean you'd stay? All of you?" "Some of us," Tank confirmed. "Enough to make sure every car gets fixed right, every customer gets treated fair, and every dollar earned goes toward your family's future." Madison felt tears building in her eyes, not the desperate, frightened tears she'd shed while working alone in the garage, but tears of relief and gratitude that she was too young to fully understand. "There's just one condition," Diesel added, his voice carrying mock seriousness that made Madison smile despite her emotions. "What condition?" "No more 3 a.m. repair sessions. 7-year-old girls belong in bed sleeping, not under the hood of cars. Deal?" Madison giggled, the first genuine laugh anyone had heard from her in weeks. "Deal. But can I still help sometimes, when I'm not supposed to be sleeping?" "Wouldn't have it any other way, little mechanic," Diesel replied. "Every good garage needs proper supervision." As the sun set over Cedar Falls, Madison looked out at the transformed garage where leather-clad bikers worked alongside her neighbors, where the tools of her father's trade gleamed under professional lighting, and where hope had replaced desperation as the driving force behind everything they built together. For the first time since her father's diagnosis, Madison Thompson fell asleep that night, believing that families, even the unlikely kind forged in grease and gratitude, really could overcome anything when they faced it together. 3 weeks into Joe Thompson's treatment in Chicago, Madison had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. School during the day, homework at the kitchen table Uncle Pete had moved into the garage office, and supervised mechanic training with whichever angels were working that afternoon. "Madison, hand me the 3/8 socket," Tank called from beneath a customer's sedan. His massive frame somehow managed to fit under vehicles that seemed impossibly small for his bulk. Madison carefully selected the correct socket from the organized tool chest, pride swelling in her chest as Tank accepted it without having to check her choice. "Tank, when Daddy comes home, will you teach him about the new diagnostic computer?" "Little bit. Your daddy's going to know more about that computer in 5 minutes than I learned in 5 weeks." Tank chuckled. "He's got instincts for engines that can't be taught." The garage phone rang, interrupting their work. Diesel emerged from the office minutes later, his expression mixing concern with determination. "That was Doc Martinez," he announced to the assembled crew. "Joe's responding better than expected to the new treatment, but there's a complication." Madison felt her stomach drop. "What kind of complication?" "The good kind," Diesel said quickly, seeing her fear. "The treatment's working so well that Doc wants to accelerate the schedule. Joe could be home in 6 weeks instead of 6 months. Uncle Pete looked up from the parts inventory he'd been managing. "That's wonderful news. So why do you look worried?" "Because Joe's insurance company is balking at paying for experimental treatment. They're threatening to cut off coverage, which means the family would be responsible for costs running into hundreds of thousands." Madison didn't understand all the numbers, but she understood enough. "We can't afford that." "No, sweetheart, you can't," Diesel agreed. "But that's where family comes in." The following Saturday, Cedar Falls witnessed something unprecedented in its 150-year history. Main Street had been transformed into the largest motorcycle rally Iowa had ever seen, with Angels chapters from 12 states converging on the small town for what they called the Thompson Family Benefit Run. Madison stood on the garage roof beside Diesel, watching in amazement as hundreds of motorcycles lined the streets like chrome and leather rivers. Food trucks operated by Angels families served everything from barbecue to funnel cakes, while local businesses reported their best sales day in decades. "How many people came?" Madison asked, overwhelmed by the crowd below. "Last count, over 800 riders plus their families," Diesel replied. "Word spread through the network that one of our own needed help. Brotherhood doesn't recognize state lines or chapter boundaries." Throughout the day, a steady stream of people approached the donation booth managed by Mrs. Henderson and Uncle Pete. Bikers who looked like they could barely afford gas money handed over $50 bills. Families drove from neighboring counties to contribute $20 and buy raffle tickets for motorcycles donated by various dealerships. But the moment that defined the day came when Sheriff Jim Morrison, the same man who'd spent years trying to run the Angels out of town, approached the booth with a thick envelope. "This is from the Police Benevolent Association," he said quietly to Uncle Pete. "We know what it's like to have family in danger. Joe Thompson's always been fair to our officers when they needed emergency vehicle repairs." Madison watched from her perch as her Uncle Pete shook hands with the sheriff, understanding instinctively that something important had just happened beyond the simple donation. By sunset, the unofficial tally had reached a number that made grown men cry. The benefit run had raised enough money not only to cover Joe Thompson's experimental treatment, but to establish a medical emergency fund for other families facing similar crises. "Madison," Diesel called as the last motorcycles prepared to leave town. "Your daddy's on the phone. Doc Martinez set up a video call so you can see him." Madison raced into the office where a laptop displayed her father's face, thinner than she remembered, but with eyes that held more hope than she'd seen in months. "Daddy!" she exclaimed, pressing close to the screen. "Hey there, little mechanic," Joe Thompson's voice carried through the speakers, weak but warm. "I hear you've been taking good care of my garage." "The Angels helped," Madison said quickly. "They fixed everything and made it better and raised money so you can get better too." Joe's eyes found Diesel in the background of the video call. "Diesel, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for my family. Joe, you treated us with respect when nobody else would. We're just returning the favor." "It's more than that," Joe insisted. "You gave my daughter a family when she needed one most. That's not something a man forgets." 6 weeks later, Joe Thompson walked through the doors of his garage for the first time in 3 months. The man who entered bore little resemblance to the cancer patient who'd been rushed to the hospital. Doc Martinez's experimental treatment had not only stopped the disease's progression, but had reversed much of the damage everyone thought was permanent. Madison launched herself into her father's arms with enough force to knock over a smaller man. But Joe caught her easily, holding her tight while tears flowed freely down his cheeks. "Daddy, look what they did to our garage," Madison said, leading him by the hand through the transformed space. And look at all the customers. And look at the new tools. And Tank taught me how to use the diagnostic computer. Joe surveyed his business with wonder. The struggling garage he'd left behind had evolved into something that resembled a professional dealership, complete with customer waiting area, expanded service bays, and equipment he'd only dreamed of owning. "This is incredible," he breathed, running his hands along a tool chest that cost more than his old truck. "Joe," Diesel approached carefully, understanding the pride issues that might complicate this homecoming. "We need to talk about the business arrangement going forward." Joe stiffened slightly, the independence that had sustained him through years of struggle asserting itself. "Diesel, I appreciate everything you've done, but I can't accept charity." "Who said anything about charity?" Tank interrupted, emerging from beneath a customer's vehicle. "We're talking about partnership. You provide the expertise and the reputation. We provide the muscle and the equipment. Profits get split fair. Everybody benefits." "Partnership?" Joe looked around at the angels who'd spent months keeping his dream alive. "Thompson and Associates Auto Repair," Wrench explained, pointing to the new sign being installed outside. "You're the Thompson, we're the Associates. Madison gets to grow up in a stable business environment. You get to focus on being healthy instead of worrying about money, and we get to be part of something that matters." Madison tugged on her father's shirt. "Daddy, they're family now. They kept their promise to take care of us." Joe knelt to his daughter's level, seeing in her eyes a confidence and security that had been missing since his diagnosis. "What kind of promise?" "When I was scared and working alone, Diesel promised that family takes care of family. He said you were already family because you always treated them good." Joe stood slowly, extending his hand toward Diesel. "Partnership it is, but I have one condition." "Name it," Diesel replied, clasping Joe's hand firmly. "Madison doesn't work past 8 p.m. on school nights. 7-year-old girls need proper bedtimes." Diesel's laughter echoed through the garage, joined by the deep chuckles of men who'd learned that the strongest bonds weren't forged in conflict, but in the quiet moments when people chose to care for each other. "Deal," Diesel said, "but she's still the best supervisor this garage has ever had." Madison beamed as she looked around at her expanded family. Her father healthy and home, Uncle Pete no longer carrying impossible burdens alone, and 8 of the toughest men in the Midwest who'd proven that family wasn't about blood, but about showing up when it mattered most. Outside, the sign for Thompson and Associates Auto Repair caught the afternoon sun, advertising not just automotive services, but the truth that sometimes the most unlikely people become exactly the family you need.